Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The Green Infrastructure, a Triple Bottom Line Approach to Environmental Justice. Today's speakers will be Matt King with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Stacey Eriksen with EPA Region 8, and Andy Kricun with Camden County Municipal Utilities Authority. Before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. Audio is available through your computer's mic and speakers or by telephone. Your call-in number and access code are in the control panel box on the right-hand side of your screen. All attendees have been muted to minimize background noise. If you have a question during the webinar, please type those into the questions box on the upper right-hand side of your screen, and we are going to have a designated time to answer your questions at the end of the webinar. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please contact us and we'll do our best to troubleshoot your issues. Now, before we launch into the webinar, I have a couple poll questions for you. First, we'd like to know how many people are viewing this webcast with you. You can vote by clicking on your screen. Great, perfect. Thank you for that. And I have another question for you as well. We'd like to know, how many years of experience do you have with green infrastructure? Excellent, excellent. It looks like we have a broad range of experience, from under a year to many people who have more than 5, but everything in between, so that's great. So now I'd like to introduce you to our first speaker, Matt King. Matt King has been an employee of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency since 2009. He's worked for EPA's Clean Water State Revolving Fund program for 8 years, before moving to the Water Permits Division, where he's a member of the Green Infrastructure team. His work is focused on engaging national stakeholders to advance the implementation of green infrastructure practices across the water sector. Matt, welcome.
Thank you, Amanda. I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us today and for your interest in green infrastructure as a stormwater management tool. One of the best aspects of working in this area is the fact that green infrastructure implementation is a multidisciplinary effort. The purpose of our Green Infrastructure webcast series is to explore that diverse subject matter, connect stakeholders, and showcase where and how green infrastructure is being used across the country. Today's topic is a very important one, and we're fortunate to have 2 practitioners that can speak to the environmental, economic, and social benefits that green infrastructure can bring to all communities. Why are green infrastructure practitioners engaged in the work that they do? Because stormwater runoff is a major cause of water pollution across the United States. When rain falls on our roofs, streets, and parking lots in cities and their suburbs, the water can't soak into the ground as it should. Stormwater drains through gutters, storm sewers, and other engineered collection systems and is discharged into nearby water bodies. Along the way, it can pick up trash, bacteria, heavy metals, nutrients, and other pollutants. These contaminants degrade water quality and threaten public health. During this webinar, we'll be discussing the concept of environmental justice through a stormwater management lens. But we want to acknowledge that this is a complex topic tied to other subject areas as well, and one that is important to many different communities across the country. If you're interested in learning more about EPA's work in the environmental justice arena, I encourage you to visit that office's website at www.epa.gov/environmental justice. The guiding principle of environmental justice is that all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, are entitled to equal protection from environmental risk. Across the United States, a variety of socioeconomic metrics are used to identify communities with environmental justice needs. But all of these communities have one thing in common: populations that suffer a disproportionate share of the negative environmental consequences resulting from industrial, governmental, and commercial operations or policies. For example, this could be due to proximity to industrial activity, contaminated sites, polluted waterways, or other environmental risks that threaten public health. These risks are relevant to stormwater management because of the fact that runoff readily transports pollutants from impervious surfaces to nearby waterways. Whatever pollutants are present have the potential to negatively impact public health and water quality for people that live nearby and also those that live downstream. But these impacts are often the most severe in poor communities that live adjacent to affected water bodies. Scenarios like the ones I've just touched on require accessible, cost-effective tools that can mitigate stormwater pollution and improve the quality of life for community residents. Green infrastructure encompasses a wide variety of stormwater management practices that can function across multiple scales. Variety makes green infrastructure a flexible technique for managing stormwater runoff and helping improve the quality of impaired waters. But green infrastructure can also provide co-benefits, such as cost savings and educational and recreational opportunities and more. This ability to not only improve water quality, but enhance the quality of life for community residents is what makes green infrastructure a triple bottom line approach to stormwater management and a very practical vehicle for pursuing environmental justice. That's why I'm excited to have presenters today that can highlight what green infrastructure is doing for communities where environmental justice is a concern. Regional and local initiatives will highlight the ways in which green infrastructure can manage stormwater pollution, help equalize access to environmental protection, and create a healthier environment in which to live and work. And now we'll introduce our first speaker.
Great, thank you, Matt. We're excited to have Stacey Eriksen with us today. And Stacey's been an employee of the Environmental Protection Agency for over 26 years, and she currently works on sustainable development, green infrastructure, urban waters, and brownfields. She's previously worked in a number of programs at EPA, including enforcement, community-based environmental protection, Superfund, hazardous waste, and as a water quality technical advisor to the International Red River Board. Stacey is a Colorado native with a BS in chemical engineering from Colorado State University and an MS in ecological engineering from Colorado School of Mines. Welcome, Stacey.
Hi, everybody. Hopefully everybody can hear me. I'm going to go through a number of slides. Some of them I'm going to go through pretty quickly. They're more as a resource, but won't spend a lot of time on them, and then we'll get to a few slides that have a bit more substance about why you all are here. First of all, a lot of communities are facing many challenges: trash and stormwater pollutants, excess volume that causes flooding and erosion, drought conditions, and an increase in impervious cover due to development. Basically, the more impervious cover that a community has, the more degraded the water becomes. As soon as you get over about 10% impervious cover, you start to see impacts, and then when you get over 25%, it really starts to degrade the surrounding streams. So there's a really big connection between water quality and the amount of impervious surface. Green infrastructure is really about enhancing communities. It's multifunctional infrastructure, and it fits in really well with complete streets and green streets. Green infrastructure is at a lot of different scales. In our region, in Region 8 out west, we have green infrastructure that we focus on large scales in order to protect our drinking water supplies. So some of the forests and the mountains are green infrastructure. There's also green infrastructure, riparian areas and wetlands. And then you have more urban sorts of green infrastructure that we'll talk a little bit more about. But green infrastructure is really about providing water quality improvements at multiple benefits and trying to infiltrate stormwater where it falls. Low-impact development is another terminology that's used sort of interchangeably with green infrastructure, but basically it's comprehensive land planning that looks at trying to maintain the hydrology and infiltrate stormwater where it falls. It's a very sustainable practice. It can be applied to new developments as well as existing developments as a retrofit, although it tends to be less expensive and function better usually when it's designed in holistically at the beginning. The picture that you see there on the screen is actually a stormwater retention area that is behind the redevelopment of the former Stapleton Airport in Denver. That is right off of Interstate 70 and takes stormwater from the interstate, also from the Bass Pro Shop and the Target store in the Northfield shopping area. It's actually quite beautiful, has a lot of wildlife in it, functions as a really great, a really large stormwater pond, but also is a great community amenity. Systems thinking is a really important way to look at different things. It's a sustainable practice, and it's looking at the whole system. Former stormwater practices were just to get the stormwater off-site as quickly as possible. Then it goes into streams, and folks didn't really look at how that impacted the that volume of stormwater impacted those streams. So when you take a bigger systems approach to things, you're trying to figure out what you're going to do with that stormwater, and looking at stormwater more as a resource, but trying to holistically integrate the green infrastructure with the other infrastructure saves money and it builds resiliency. Green infrastructure, as I mentioned before, mimics the natural hydrologic cycle. It tries to slow down, spread it out, and soak in the stormwater. It can be integrated into parks and open space, urban forestry, parking lot landscaping. It can be part of climate adaptation strategies, resilience strategies, and flood restoration work. The pictures that you see on your screen, the top one is actually from the Stapleton redevelopment, the former airport. That is Westerly Creek, actually during a flood event. Westerly Creek was originally in a culvert under taxiways and runways. It was daylighted. They've done a spectacular job. I don't think you would know that it was once in a pipe, and it functions really well in storm events, as you can see. They allowed the stream to have an adequate floodplain. They have houses, actually fairly expensive houses on either side, that front onto the open space, but that they don't have to worry about flooding impacts from it. And the bottom picture you see is actually a parking lot in Boulder, Colorado, and it just shows how you can use landscaping and curb cuts in order to use stormwater in order to water the plants and trees. A lot of different types of green infrastructure, including green roofs, planter boxes, rain gardens, bioswales and bioretention cells. Also, sometimes they're called vegetated swales, tree trenches, or a particular type of swale, ponds, different types of porous pavements. Green streets and complete streets can integrate some of those functions. And then wetlands and riparian areas are also sort of natural green infrastructure. And then rainwater harvesting is another green infrastructure type of practice. The photos that you see on the screen there, the top one is actually on, oops, just sorry, I just advanced that too far. Sorry about that. The top photo is actually on the Convention Center for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Salt Lake City. It's a green roof. And the bottom photo that you see is actually at Fort Carson, Colorado, and that is a bioswale. Green infrastructure provides a lot of value for stormwater management, climate adaptation, urban heat island, biodiversity, air quality improvements, clean water, healthy soils, recreation, and quality of life. The photos that you see on this particular slide, the top one is the taxi redevelopment in the River North area, which is one of the hot new areas in the Denver metro area. It's along the banks of the South Platte River. It was a former yellow cab taxi site. I don't think that most folks looking at it know that this landscaping is actually for stormwater. It's really quite beautiful and looks like just sort of regular landscaping. And the bottom photo is also at Fort Carson, Colorado. It's a bioswale that has irises in it, and quite beautiful again, and looks very natural. But it helps them with their stormwater requirements and their MS4 permit. A lot of different ways of getting to incorporating green infrastructure into community, including regional stormwater planning, best management practices, stormwater ordinances, zoning and building codes, shared parking, volume reduction requirements, street setbacks, bioretention requirements, tree canopy, riparian setbacks, looking at street width and parking requirements in order to make room for more green infrastructure, and also changing water and stormwater pricing structures. There are a lot of additional benefits to green infrastructure, including reduced stormwater runoff volumes, enhancing groundwater recharge, pollutant reductions, reducing sewer overflow events for communities that have combined sewers, increasing carbon sequestration, reducing energy demands, increasing wildlife habitat and recreational space, human health improvements, increased land values, less splash, spray, and ponding and noise and pollutants coming off of permeable pavements. Green infrastructure can be less expensive than gray infrastructure, particularly in the long term. It's much more aesthetically pleasing, it improves quality of life, and it's a community amenity. And it makes communities much more resilient. Green infrastructure does require a different type of operation and maintenance. So it's something that's important to consider on the front end, including things like monitoring infiltration and drainage, pruning and mowing, mulching, watering and fertilization, removing and replacing dead plants, doing inlet, outlet, and under drain inspections if those are part of the design. And all those are done at different frequencies, and so it's important to think about that because it's very different from maintaining gray infrastructure. The photo that you see there is actually Greenway Park, also in the Stapleton redevelopment. This sort of shows what plants look like in the fall in a semi-arid climate. One of the challenges to doing green infrastructure in a semi-arid climate is this green infrastructure did take irrigation in order to establish the vegetation, and so it was irrigated for about 3 years before they could turn off the irrigation system. There is a difference between cost of green and gray, and it kind of depends on where you draw your system boundaries on the cost, but many of the studies are showing that green infrastructure can be actually cheaper, and particularly when you look at it in the long run. There's a few tools, including a calculator and some other studies that I've listed in the slide that folks can look at later, but green can actually be cheaper. EPA has a few funding sources for green infrastructure. We don't have a lot of money to do this, and most of our things are more pilot projects and other things, but Section 319 non-point source grants, which come through the states, Clean Water State Revolving Loan Funds. The loan funds can also give out grants, but they have a 10% green reserve, portion of that which can be used for green infrastructure. We have some urban water small grants and environmental small grants that can be used for green infrastructure design. We have some green infrastructure technical assistance available in the past, although we've not had that recently. We've also have quite a bit of brownfields funding that we've been able to successfully use to help plan and design green infrastructure. There's also Greening America's Communities through EPA's Office of Community Revitalization. They have a building blocks assistance and also the Greening America's Communities, and that's successfully been used for green infrastructure projects. There's also some finance centers and some some recent funding for water infrastructure and financing that's been used for green infrastructure, and also EPA gives some funds to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation for their 5-star and urban waters grants, and some of those have been used for green infrastructure. Typically, green infrastructure is funded from a lot of other sources: stormwater fees, homeowner and business incentives, combined sewer ordinance orders from EPA or the states, also on occasion supplemental environmental projects from enforcement actions, or natural resource damage claim settlements from Superfund sites. In the semi-arid West, green infrastructure is a little bit challenging. So in Denver, we get about 15 inches of precipitation a year, over 300 days of sunshine, infrequent and intense storms, and sometimes we call it brown or taupe infrastructure because it doesn't always look green. A lot of folks don't think you can actually do it here because the plant palette is really different from someplace like Portland or Seattle or the East Coast, but it's definitely possible. It's really important to use low water native plants in that case. And the photo that you've seen there is actually a sod roof in Jackson, Wyoming. Sod roofs are widely used in Norway, another type of green roof. Out in our region, we don't have combined sewer overflows, and so we don't have some of the enforcement actions and some of the issues that are typical east of the Mississippi. We also have some challenges in that our Western water law works significantly differently, and so if somebody else owns the water, it's called prior appropriation. We also have a lot of clay soils that don't infiltrate well, and so basically that means that you really need to design and engineer for infiltration. You really need site-specific design and installation, and you need irrigation to get the plants established. The photo you see at the bottom there is the former Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver before they moved locations, and that actually is green infrastructure as art. Plant selection in a semi-arid climate is key. Looking at soil type and permeability. Kentucky bluegrass is not preferred as a plant material in green infrastructure out here due to the amount of irrigation it requires, fertilization, the shallow root structure it has, which doesn't tend to break up the soils very well, and so it doesn't allow for a lot of infiltration. One of the things that's also real important with green infrastructure that is used along roadways is to use salt-tolerant plants like grasses or deciduous trees. Conifer trees are less salt-tolerant and don't do particularly well along roadways. Number of barriers to green infrastructure, including design, construction, and maintenance costs. Sometimes there's mixed messages across agencies. There can be a misperception on economics, and so I think actually looking at a lot of the studies that have been done in more recent projects can actually help with that. Not integrating green infrastructure into regional or site planning and trying to do it later tends to make it tougher. Folks don't always trust new technologies, and then out west trying to irrigate plants and get them established can sometimes be a barrier. The photos that you see in this particular slide are also, the top one is Stapleton again. This is actually 29th Avenue, and this is a median that runs down the middle of the street that has running paths, bike paths, and a lot of green infrastructure. And the photo that you see on the bottom is actually Odell Brewery in Fort Collins, Colorado. That's parking lot landscaping. It wasn't quite very established when this photo was taken, but it shows you the cuts and stormwater infiltrating there that can be used to water plants. There's a number of websites and tools for western and semi-arid climates for the folks that are interested, and there's some links there. Denver has a really good ultra-urban green infrastructure guideline. Urban Drainage and Flood Control District has a really good criteria manual, which a lot of our states in the West use. Also, the Colorado State University Stormwater Center is a great resource Those are available for your use to look at later. And the photos that you see on this particular side, the top photo is the South Platte River, right near the Denver metropolitan area. It shows some particular areas that are used to, in higher storm events, to absorb stormwater. And the photo that you see on the bottom is actually right nearby. It's a bike path with permeable pavers on it. It's right near the REI store along the South Platte River. There's some national websites and tools, and those are there. EPA has a number of different tools. There's also an international stormwater BMP database. There aren't a lot of examples for the West, but it's still a good resource. There's also a great Greenstream listserv that Matt helps run if you're interested in getting regular updates. EPA has a great tool that was put out by our Office of Research and Development. It's called the Green Infrastructure Wizard, or GWiz. It's also a really great tool, and it makes it a little bit easier to find. Some of the things that are on EPA's web pages that may not be is easy to find, and so I highly suggest that folks use GWiz in order to look for different information on green infrastructure. Here in Region 8 in Denver, we've done a number of green infrastructure projects using EPA funding, and I'm not going to go into a whole lot of these. We've used a lot of different funding sources, including urban waters, brownfields, green infrastructure technical assistance in greening America's communities. The photo that you see right there is actually a conceptual design in a park in an environmental justice neighborhood. It's called Westerly Creek. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. It's called New Freedom Park. We've also done some work in a neighborhood called Mariposa, or it used to be called South Lincoln Homes. This was part of our Partnership for Sustainable Community. We actually funded 3 design charrettes, and one of them was on green infrastructure and stormwater. This was done for the Denver Housing Authority, and so they have looked at redeveloping sites, putting affordable housing on them, and then using mixed-use development, and have done some really innovative things with green infrastructure. The City of Denver allowed Denver Housing Authority to pilot a number of things that weren't previously allowed under their city ordinance because they're a quasi-governmental organization. So here's some photos showing some of the green infrastructure at the Mariposa site. The folks at Denver Housing Authority did a really great job of doing a lot of outreach to the environmental justice community there. A lot of the folks are immigrants, speaking a lot of different languages. They held a lot of community meetings, went door to door, and sat down with a lot of folks. But you can see a number of things in there, including some permeable pavements, with some signage on there telling people to be careful about not using salt on there. You see some really lovely planter boxes and some rain garden type structures there. These are photos of Westerly Creek that I mentioned earlier, New Freedom Park in Denver, Colorado. This is an EJ neighborhood, low-lying, floods quite a bit, in between 2 major redevelopments at the former Lowry Air Force Base and at the Stapleton former airport. This is an area that doesn't have a big developer to come in and has a lot of affordable housing in it. And so on the left-hand side of your screen, you can see what the Westerly Creek looked like before the green infrastructure was put in, and on the pictures on the right, you can actually see what it looks like today after they put it in. So this was a fairly long process. EPA provided some funding to do a design. The city followed up with a design and decided to extend it a little bit further, and the city was able to put some funding in along with some natural resource damage claim funding in order to put all that together. That took about 10 years probably to get from start to finish and get that all installed. The photos that you see there are Weir Gulch and Sun Valley. So Sun Valley is also a Denver Housing Authority affordable housing community. It's the poorest zip code in the state of Colorado and one of the poorest nationally. It has a very large immigrant community with folks speaking a lot of different languages. A lot of folks coming from refugee camps and other areas. The elementary school has almost 100% free and reduced school lunch programs, so it's a pretty poor community. Denver Housing Authority is actually looking at redeveloping the whole site. They are in the process of they've constructed some of the new housing, but they're actually creating an eco district here. But one of the first things that got done while they were doing design work on the site is the city actually decided to there's gulches on both sides, and the gulch that you see there on the left is Weir Gulch. It was a concrete trapezoidal channel. It was quite dangerous. The South Platte River, which fronts to the south, had very steep embankments, and so the city and urban drainage came in, laid back the banks of the river, created some access points and some jetties, tore out the concrete on Weir Gulch and replanted it. So on the left you can see what it looked like before, or actually during the construction, and on the right you can see what it looks like today. And some of the work. The work there is ongoing. The housing hasn't been rebuilt there, and so the other green infrastructure hasn't been installed yet on that site. So EPA became involved in that project, trying to help with some of the design costs originally. We ended up doing actually a green infrastructure options study for that particular site that actually looked at 4 different options for doing green infrastructure on the site. And what I'd like to point out with that study is available for folks to look at. It was actually done by ICF and CH2M and Van Meter, Williams, and Pollock. And it looks at 4 different scenarios. And the green infrastructure scenario that had a lot of green infrastructure in it actually ended up being the least expensive when you looked at upfront construction costs and 20-year maintenance costs when you looked at them combined. And so most folks don't actually look at green, pricing out a bunch of different options. And we ended up doing that to look and try to see how that would work for a housing authority and what the maintenance costs were. Here's another project, Johnson Habitat Park, that is part of the overall improvements to the South Platte River. It's a regional park that was put in. You can see some photos there of conceptual designs, what it looked like kind of during construction, and at the bottom what it looks like today. A lot of the areas along the South Platte River are industrial, and the few neighborhoods that are actually nearby the South Platte River tend to be environmental justice communities. So some of these, putting in these regional parks and putting in green infrastructure has a big impact on those communities. Here was another project we did for the Urban Land Conservancy. Again, affordable housing near a light rail station and looking at green infrastructure options. I think that one of the things that was really important in this was we did a really great design charrette at a Housing Colorado conference. And what was important was bringing together a lot of different officials, architects, and students to look at the green infrastructure. What I want to show you here is, this is particularly important out west, but in a lot of places, trying to design green infrastructure appropriately and trying to do the proper engineering work so it infiltrates the amount of stormwater that you actually need to deal with. And these are just slides that show a little bit of the number crunching that goes into making that happen. This project is a project that we just completed, again in an environmental justice area along a street called Morrison Road. It's an area with a lot of trailer parks, a large Hispanic community, but basically working with the community and the business owners to create a community plaza, to have green infrastructure elements. The area had a lot of brownfields issues that need to be dealt with, and so that's one of the considerations in looking at the design. There's a lot of partners working in that particular community, including the Urban Land Conservancy, the Trust for Public Land, and this design was a real holistic design. They integrated a lot of things with the community that the community actually asked for, and so that was one of the key things to do. Looked at the plaza as a catalyst for the community, trying to create a community space for events, art, and food, using traffic calming by closing one of the streets. It's kind of a funky neighborhood in that the street is diagonal and there's a lot of other streets coming in, and it creates some very interesting intersections that are a little bit dangerous. And so they actually looked at closing off one street and then using temporary closures on one of the other streets in order to create a larger plaza space. And it incorporated bioswales and rain garden buffers as well as permeable pavers into the design. I think one of the big takeaways, in particularly working with environmental justice communities, is listening to the community. They live there, they know what they want, and they have great ideas. All of the projects that I talked about, and we couldn't talk about them, in a lot of depth, but the communities offered a lot of input about what they wanted, and the community input actually made the designs better. You need to really consider maintenance when you're thinking about putting in green infrastructure, because if the plants die or it gets filled with trash and it's not maintained later, it then doesn't become a community amenity. So it's really important to think about that up front, trying to figure out how to design for success up front. Also really found that a conceptual design will get the community on board and help you find funding. So even if you don't have all of the funding lined up in front and some of these projects really take a long time, you'll get there because you just have to take it step by step. And so I think that's hard in particularly working with environmental justice communities, sometimes when you don't know the answer and what exactly you're going to get in the end, but at least giving them the first pieces, allowing them input. The Westerly Creek community that I talked to you about was one of the really interesting one. There's 3 affordable housing providers around that particular neighborhood and a lot of refugees, but one of the things that they said was a lot of them came from Africa and a lot of refugee camps. They said, wow, they were surprised that the government actually listened to them, that both EPA was there and that the city was there and actually listened to their input. I think one of the other unique things about that project was we actually had a kids design piece. We had it actually run by a local group called Earth Force, and we had kids community input, and the design changed because of the input of the kids, because they were the ones that were really using the space. So really listening to the community and getting them on board, they will help you carry the project forward. So that's it for me. I wanted to thank everybody, and I look forward to your questions later. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Stacey. That's really interesting. Our next speaker is going to be Andy Kricun. So Andy, let me give you screen control here. And while you pull that up, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Andy. Andy is the Executive Director and Chief Engineer of the Camden County Municipal Utilities Authority, operators of an 80 million gallon per day wastewater treatment facility located in Camden, New Jersey. Andy has a degree in chemical engineering from Princeton University and over 30 years of experience in wastewater and biosolids management. He serves on the board of the National Association of Clean Water Agencies and is the chair of its Utility of the Future and its Community Service Committees. He also serves on the New Jersey Environmental Justice Advisory Council and chairs its Water Equity Task Force. Andy, we're excited to hear from you.
Thanks very much, Amanda, and thanks to Matt King for the invitation and the opportunity. And it's great to follow Stacey's terrific comments. That those are tremendous work that's being done out in Region 8. So I basically have 3 main takeaways from this talk. And the first is that your zip code should not determine whether or not you have access to safe drinking water, or whether your children walk through combined sewage to get to their bus stop. That basically everyone is entitled to a certain level safe drinking water and clean water in their lives, and that is a principal tenet of environmental justice. Second is that clean water utilities have a tremendous opportunity to make a positive impact on environmental justice communities because of our resources and our need to protect the public health and improve their quality of life. And third, green infrastructure is a terrific way to provide quality of life benefits to our neighbors and residents. So let me start by talking about the a change in paradigm in clean water utilities. As Amanda mentioned, I operate a wastewater utility in Camden, New Jersey, and I'll talk a bit more about that. But I want to talk generally about the water sector. And the old paradigm, the clean water utility of the past, is that the ceiling of aspirations for clean water utilities was to meet the permit and minimize interaction with the community and with regulatory agencies and the press. Basically, stay under the radar and stay away from other stakeholders. And that really is an old school paradigm. I'm glad to report that there's a new initiative that EPA and the National Association of Clean Water Agencies, NACWA, and the Water Environment Federation, WEF, are working on, called the Clean Water Utility of the Future. And where the old paradigm was that the permit compliance was the ceiling of aspirations, that was sufficient for a clean water utility. Now that's the floor. Of course, we need to meet the permit, and that is really should be the floor of our aspirations. There are many more things that we can do as clean water utilities, such as optimize our water quality, reduce our carbon footprint, and provide green energy for our plant, and green infrastructure and community service. And we'll be talking a lot about green infrastructure and community service, as Matt and Stacey already have been. These are tremendous opportunities for clean water utility of the future. I'm really glad to report that over 150 utilities have already signed up for the Clean Water Utility of the Future initiative. And in fact, a quick aside, that there is the registration, I think, is due by the end of this month for the coming year to join this initiative, where clean water utilities are working together to try to make a positive difference for the public and for the environment above and beyond our normal permit compliance obligations. So, as Amanda said, I have over 30 years of experience, and it's all been here in Camden. Camden is one of the most economically stressed communities in the country. An average household income of $26,000, unemployment rate of 9.8%, significant crime and education challenges as well. So I have seen how clean water utilities can have an impact both to the good and to the bad in communities, and especially environmental justice communities where, as Matt said earlier, there's a disproportionate environmental burden on these communities. So I think just like people grow throughout their lives and have, hopefully grow and go through a learning curve in their own lives, so too can agencies, entities like our utility. And so I'd say there are 4 levels or stages of utility investment in the communities that we serve. It starts with indifference, where, as I said earlier, that old paradigm, the clean water utility of the past, was basically indifferent to the community and would stay away from it. Our goal was to meet our permit, to do our job, and that was really it. A next stage up is to be, but let me just say that indifference can do quite a bit of harm. So, for example, our wastewater treatment plant is only 100 yards away from a residential neighborhood. So if we're only focusing on meeting the permit but not thinking about how our operations can impact our neighborhood, that indifference can be harmful, such as odor problems or truck traffic and there's construction interference, etc. So the second level beyond indifference would be to do no harm. So at a minimum, be neutral to this community. Eliminate odors, eliminate impacts, and so that the wastewater treatment facility at least is neutral. And that's definitely a step forward. But I would argue that while that's necessary, that's not sufficient. Doing no harm is morally neutral. If you're a citizen who does no harm but also does no good, that is very much morally neutral. And I think clean water utilities have, just as we all do, have the capacity to do great good. So do clean water utilities. And so the third level, I guess, would be to actually be a proactive good neighbor and to strive to make a positive difference in your neighborhood. And ultimately, I think the ultimate level, which we as a utility are striving for, and many in the clean water industry are striving for, is to actually be a proactive advocate for the community, to be an anchor institution that's invested in the quality of life of the community we serve. And that, I think, is ultimately what clean water utilities should strive for. And there are many utilities in the country that are really terrific at doing that. Just to mention a few, always think of San Francisco, Seattle, Louisville, Atlanta, Milwaukee, Cleveland. But there are many others, and I don't mean to leave any out, but there are several utilities that are really invested in being community service advocates and anchor institutions in their cities and communities. And that's something that our utility is striving to be as well. So now that I've sort of given a general overview of the state of play in the clean water industry and shown the range of impact, negative to indifference or positive, by being an anchor institution, and that how clean water utilities can impact your neighborhoods, let me speak more specifically about my utility, the Camden County MUA in Camden, New Jersey. And for those who aren't familiar with Camden, I already gave you some demographics about it. Camden is literally right across the Delaware River from the city of Philadelphia. So I can look out my window and see Philadelphia, and I'm a big Philadelphia fan, and I'm still heartbroken about our team's loss to Toronto last weekend. But anyway, so we service 500,000 customers in southern New Jersey. It's an 80 million gallon per day wastewater treatment plant. If you look at the northwest corner of our wastewater treatment plant, the picture there, you can see that the residential neighborhood is only 100 yards away. So you can see that the lack of odor control in the beginning of our sort of traversing our learning curve really could have had an adverse impact. But now with odor control, all funded through the State Revolving Fund, thanks to EPA, we have basically eliminated odors from the treatment plant and now have no adverse impact on our neighbors that seek to be a good neighbor and an anchor institution. Let me talk a little bit about the State Revolving Fund, because that comes into our story a little bit. The State Revolving Fund is an EPA program, the successor of the old federal grant program that started in 1987. Each of the states had their own program, but basically the idea is that they loan out, the state loans out funds that they receive from EPA at a very, very low interest rate. Here in New Jersey, we get less than 1% interest rate spread out over 30 years. So it's a tremendous program that the EPA has implemented and then implemented through the 50 states. We've been a tremendous beneficiary of it. We upgraded our entire wastewater treatment plant, including the odor control systems that I mentioned, through the State Revolving Fund. And because of the low interest rate, because of the 30-year duration, and because of the fact that these improvements actually lower operational costs because newer equipment requires less maintenance, newer equipment is more less energy intensive, and so therefore operation and maintenance cost savings actually exceeded the debt service because of the low interest rates of the loans. So we were able to use that to basically rebuild our wastewater treatment plant and hold our rate. So the effluent quality improved significantly. We were meeting the permit, as I said, when we were a utility of the past. As a utility of the future, our effluent quality is much, much better than the permit requirements. And as you can see, 50% more tons captured over this program. And because of the State Revolving Fund making it affordable, our annual user fee only went up by 4% total in a span of 23 years. So when you add for inflation, that's a 40% rate cut. That's really important because by not raising rates, but while still improving our environmental performance, it gave us a lot of latitude to deal with Camden City's combined sewage flooding problem, because we did have, some rate flexibility because of, not raising the rates for 20-some years, and second, the State Revolving Fund, as Stacey mentioned, is an option for funding of green infrastructure as well. So having had such a good experience using the State Revolving Fund in our gray infrastructure projects, when we turned our attention, striving to be an anchor institution in Camden, dealing with Camden City's combined sewage flooding problem, we naturally looked at the State Revolving Fund as a funding option. So here's a picture of Camden City from a few years ago. This is after a 1-inch rain event, which is not, obviously it's not a drizzle, but it's not, a hurricane or tornado either. This was just a heavy rain, and the entire city was flooded. Camden City has a combined sewer system, which I think many of you know, but just real quickly, combined sewer system is sort of the state-of-the-art for sewer systems in the late 19th century, the early adopters. Rather than putting in 2 pipes, one for stormwater and one for sewage, they thought they were saving money back in the late 19th century by putting it just one pipe and having the rainwater and the sewage go into one pipe. Now, it's just, I always think that is so illustrative of how things have changed in the sense of environmental conservation. Nowadays, you would never think of mixing sewage with rainwater, because if you mix a gallon of sewage with a gallon of rainwater, you now have 2 gallons of sewage, and you have contaminated, our very precious water resource. But in the late 19th century, and for all of human history before, people, really thought that the planet's resources were infinite, and that there was little that mankind could do to really make a difference. Well, in today's age, when we think about climate change and recycling and water conservation and energy conservation, that really is a thing of the past. And now we are constantly reminded of the finite resources of our planet and how much of an impact we can make. So green infrastructure is really a way of turning back the clock and undoing some of the thoughtless ways that we dealt with the environment in the late 19th century and early 20th century. So one of the big reasons that combined sewers were ineffective, besides contaminating clean rainwater, is that it was constructed before the advent of the automobile. And Stacey talked about how impervious surface has such an adverse impact on water quality, and of course that's true. When they were building these combined sewer systems before the advent of the automobile, most roads were dirt. There weren't any sidewalks, garages, parking lots, driveways. Roads weren't paved, as I said. So the majority of the rainwater just soaked into the ground. Well, now cities are 50, 60, 70% impervious surface because of these improvements that relate to the advent of the automobile. So the idea of green infrastructure, really, the simplest thing is it's really to undo that, to depave the cities, restore green, pervious surface, so that the ground can soak up the storm water. It won't get into the sewer system. It reduces the potential of combined sewage flooding or combined sewage overflows. It reduces the contamination of rainwater with sewage by letting the stormwater, not be interrupted from the normal, water cycle, but actually get into the ground, into the groundwater, and resume and continue the clean water cycle. So, green infrastructure is a terrific solution to undo the harm of impervious surface and combined sewer systems. So, our resiliency goals for Camden City, I mentioned that it floods in Camden City with combined sewage nearly every time it rains. But our aim is to be an anchor institution. So, the old paradigm, as I said, was just to meet the permit. The new paradigm is to be an anchor institution, and that includes what I said at the very beginning, that every person, no matter what zip code you live in, no matter what neighborhood you're in, your children should not walk through puddles of combined sewage to get to their bus stops. You shouldn't have combined sewage in your basement when it rains. It's a public health issue. It's a social justice issue. It's an environmental justice issue. So working with the EPA and the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection and over 60 environmental and community service nonprofits, we're working on a very aggressive plan to eliminate combined sewage flooding for up to the 1-inch storm by the end of next year. In addition, we're very concerned about resiliency. And although this is a talk about green infrastructure, I do want to mention that resiliency is very important as well, because if the wastewater treatment plant is out of power due to a power outage due to a severe storm, then sewage will be backing up into people's homes, sewage in the streets, in the parks, or into the rivers that we serve. So getting ourselves off the grid and eliminating our reliance on electricity is very important for a clean water utility in any community, but especially in a city where people are underserved. We want to make sure that they don't have to worry about sewage backing up into their basements or in their streets when there's a power outage. So another goal that we have is to get off the grid by June of next year. And then the third thing ultimately is to create a resilient microgrid for Camden's hospitals, drinking water plant, schools, fire, and police by the end of 2022 to actually generate more electricity than we need and send that out to these vulnerable infrastructures so that if there is a citywide power outage, the hospitals still will be served, the fire, the police will still be served, and the schools and drinking water plant will still be running, while still reducing the carbon footprint of the cities of the city. So those are our goals. How are we implementing them? Well, the first thing I should mention is a very important takeaway, and I alluded to it already, is that it's very difficult to do it alone, and it's not necessary. When we were, let's say, a clean water utility of the past, where our permit compliance was the ceiling of aspirations, we were staying away from stakeholders, like I said. But when you're trying to do the right thing, you often find willing partners, and many hands makes for lighter work. So working with EPA Region 2 and with the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, we formed the Camden Collaborative Initiative, which is a collaboration, a voluntary collaboration among EPA, New Jersey DEP, my utility, Camden County MUA, and over 60 environmental and community service nonprofits like the Trust for Public Land and the Nature Conservancy nationally, but also statewide, like the Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, or the New Jersey Conservation Foundation, or New Jersey Tree Foundation, or very locally, right in neighborhood communities, all working together voluntarily to deal with Camden City's environmental challenges. And so in that time, since we formed the Collaborative Initiative in 2014, we've created 3 very large riverfront parks and daylighted a stream that had been paved over, created 60 rain gardens throughout Camden City, greened a total of 125 acres, that's on the green side, replaced Camden City's worst sewer lines, and expanded our treatment plant to receive more wastewater, all at the cost of about $60 million of investment. That program, which we've already completed, plus the balance that we're going to complete in the next 18 years, will eliminate combined sewage flooding in Camden City for up to the 1-inch storm, which is the majority of storms that one would experience. So the basic combined sewage flooding will be, for the most part, eliminated by the end of next year, thanks to this multi-pronged, multi-partnered program. So green infrastructure is making a tremendous difference in our community. So let me describe. So you might ask, well, how are we paying for that $60 million? Well, I gave you a little bit of a spoiler earlier. We used the state revolving fund so successfully to meet our water quality goals and odor control goals at our wastewater treatment plant. It was natural that we would turn to the state revolving fund, again, a program sponsored by EPA that Matt worked in for many years before his current position in EPA, and then also been funded to the individual 50 states. And I have to put a shout out to the New Jersey Environmental Infrastructure Bank, which has funded the majority of our green and gray infrastructure projects for the last 30 years. So that we had $60 million in debt that we incurred to construct all this green and gray infrastructure. We received $6 million in principal forgiveness, which basically means it's a grant. You don't have to pay it back. The remaining $54 million is a 30-year loan, less than 1% interest. So that means that basically for all this work in eliminating Camden's flooding problems, it's costing us about $2 million a year in annual debt service. And so therefore, we do not have to raise rates in order to accomplish this flooding benefit for Camden City and for the residents of Camden. And of course, there's significant water quality benefits too, because the overflows are also eliminated as well. So green infrastructure is a tremendous way that clean water utilities can help their communities deal with severe environmental problems and public health problems. And EPA's State Revolving Fund is a great way to do it without causing rate impacts on our communities. And consider how important that is to the success of the program. First of all, I mentioned at the beginning that Camden City is one of the most economically distressed communities in the country. And so they can't afford rate increases. And so a rate increase would have been problematic, even though they needed this public health benefit. And our suburban communities certainly wouldn't appreciate a rate increase that's helping Camden City. But by being able to do this without raising rates, because of the tremendous benefit of the State Revolving Fund, we were able to do the right thing for our community, improve the environment and water quality, protect the public health, and do it without raising rates. Here are a few examples. One thing I will say, working in a city like Camden, which is an environmental justice community like Camden, which is very economically distressed, the one silver lining about it, well, there's a lot of silver linings. I mean, one silver lining is that the people are amazing. You see so many amazing people that are struggling through their challenges and doing it with amazing fortitude, and just they're amazingly inspirational. So that is just a blessing in and of itself. But another silver lining is the fact that when there are so many issues, that every project has a lot of low-hanging fruit, a lot of win-wins. And here's an opportunity, an example of that opportunity. So before, our Phoenix Park project was an abandoned factory on the Delaware River. 6 acres of impervious surface are therefore added to the combined sewage flooding problem. Contaminated soil from this factory, including radioactive soil, that was running off into the Delaware River, so a water quality problem. And the park is right on the river, and so therefore it was blocking riverfront access for our environmental justice community. However, with help from the State Revolving Fund, we were able to convert it, and you can see it's right next to our wastewater treatment plant, we were able to convert it into 6 acres of impervious surface into a 6-acre riverfront park right on the community. And so people can now walk right from their neighborhood right up to the river and see a sunset, see the Philadelphia skyline. The contaminated soil, including the radioactive soil, was all removed, and so therefore no longer runs off into the river, and combined sewage flooding in the community is significantly reduced by the conversion of 6 acres of impervious surface from the old factory into 6 acres of green space. Here is a program, as I said, that prior to the advent of the automobile, people really weren't thinking about the environment, and so in the 1920s they paved over the Baldwin's Run, which is a stream that's a tributary of the Delaware River. Using SRF funding, we daylighted the stream and turned it into this beautiful riverfront park right on the Delaware River for another community in Camden. Now, another thing I will say. So, as I said, in total we've greened 125 acres thus far, and our goal is to green 10% of the city. So, we hope to be up to 200 acres of greened acres by the end of our program, and always looking for more opportunities as well. And as I said, the combination of green infrastructure plus gray infrastructure improvements, upgrades of the sewer system and our wastewater treatment plant will eliminate combined sewage flooding and overflows for most rainstorms by the end of 2020, all funded through the State Revolving Fund, and therefore we're able to accomplish this without raising rates. So a tremendous opportunity. And one thing I will say, it's completely replicable. If we can do it here in Camden City, we can. Anyone can really do it. And thanks to the State Revolving Fund, low interest loan, and long 30-year payback period. The other thing I would say is that good begets good. So now we have this 125 acres of green infrastructure, rain gardens, parks that we've created for Camden City. What do we do with them? Well, certainly, as Stacey said very well, you have to maintain them. If you don't maintain them, they'll actually become a nuisance and an eyesore. So the normal approach to maintaining green infrastructure might be that you would hire a landscaping company to do it. However, if you're looking at the city you serve from a standpoint of an intentionality of wanting to be an anchor institution, you look at every aspect of your operation from a triple bottom line basis. How can we accomplish what we need to do on an environmental basis, do it cost effectively, but also provide a community service as well? And so we were very fortunate to be right across the river from Philadelphia, who's one of the main proponents of green infrastructure. They had a program that we borrowed called PowerCorps. PowerCorps is an AmeriCorps grant in which AmeriCorps basically funds 50% of this. So it's a 50% matching fund from the local share of Philadelphia and ours in Camden. We hire at-risk youth that might have a criminal record of some minor sort, or don't have a high school degree, don't have training. They're at risk. So they're getting paid 8 hours a day to maintain our green infrastructure, our rain gardens, our parks. They're also getting life skills training at the same time on how to write a resume, how to go to work, how to deal with the problems they may have had at home, to really help turn them around. And then they get job placement services after 6 months, and then a new cohort comes in. Thus far, 240 at-risk youth, young men and women from 18 to 25, have been working on our and maintaining our rain gardens and parks, getting training from Rutgers, a state university, and our partners, the New Jersey Tree Foundation and New Jersey Conservation Foundation. So they now leave with a credential, of how to maintain, green spaces, and can get a job, in gardens or landscaping, and also have gotten assistance with the issues that challenge them. But meanwhile, we're maintaining our rain gardens. So it's this idea of looking at things through the lens of triple bottom line, as Matt said at the beginning, that you're looking for environmental benefit, you're looking to do it cost effectively, of course. You're also looking for opportunities for community service as well, to make a difference for the people, for the lives of the people that we serve. So the PowerCorps is one of my favorite programs. We're so grateful to the city of Philadelphia for having formed it and sharing their playbook with us. And that's something that is not only is green infrastructure programs like Rain Garden and the PowerCorps and other programs replicable, there are public sector entities like Philadelphia and like ourselves now that want to pay it forward and help our partners in the clean water sector replicate programs in their cities and communities. I mentioned our green, that's just a picture of our solar panels that we're looking at, looking for green energy opportunities as well, and we'll be off the grid by the summer of 2020. So in conclusion, the clean water utility of the past basically had this paradigm of meet the permit and stay away from the public, and certainly stay away from the regulators. But clean water utilities, like everyone, need to be the change that we wish to see in the world, to borrow from Mahatma Gandhi. And we have a tremendous opportunity to use our resources to become anchor institutions in the communities that we serve and environmental champions. That, second, green infrastructure is a tremendous way to provide triple line benefits to the communities that we serve. And thanks to the State Revolving Fund, we clean water utilities can do this without having to have significant rate impact, and in our case, no rate impact on our community that we serve or our other ratepayers. So I strongly recommend replication of the kind of programs you've heard that Stacey talked about out in Region 8, or what Philadelphia is doing, what our other clean water utility partners are doing. And certainly we'd be glad to assist any clean water utility that wanted to replicate what we're doing here in Camden, New Jersey. Thanks very much for listening.
Great, thank you so much, Andy. Now we are going to get to the questions. We have several that have come in, and I encourage anyone that does have questions to keep those coming. You can just type those into the chat box. So we have a mix of questions here for Stacey and for Andy. So I'm just gonna start reading through these. The first one, though, is for Matt. Matt, are these slides going to be available for download?
We're actually making a recording of today's webinar, and that'll be available on our website approximately 2 weeks from now. You'll be able to find it at www.epa.gov/green infrastructure. And if folks would like to get in touch with me to request copies of today's slides, I'd be happy to provide those on an individual basis. You can contact me at king.matt@epa.gov. That's king.matt@epa.gov.
Great, thanks, Matt. Andy, do you mind pulling up the last slide of yours so that people can see all of your contact information?
Yeah, sorry about that. You only told me that 2 or 3 times the first time. Sorry about that.
No worries, no worries. Okay, this question is for Stacey. A couple people have asked this actually, the exact same question, but they're wondering, what is an eco-district?
Oh, that's like that's a really interesting question. Actually, if you Google it, it's probably better than me trying to explain it. But it's actually looking at trying to create a sustainable development. And so they're sort of looking at everything. There's a lot of environmental justice issues that are incorporated, but they look at green energy and green building. They look at sustainability. They're looking at green infrastructure. They're looking at potentially looking at district-wide energy solutions for generating their electricity, for dealing with their stormwater, and some of those things. So it's actually a nonprofit that actually runs the Eco District program, and there's a lot of good information. And so Sun Valley Eco District is just one of multiple eco districts across the country.
Great, thank you. Next question is also for Stacey. How can CSOs fund green infrastructure?
That might be a better question for Andy, because out west here we don't have combined sewer overflows. Typically, I think I had one slide, about some funding sources. A lot of folks use stormwater utilities or a combined water utility to fund some of their work. Some of it have done it under consent decrees with EPAs or the states, because they were discharging sewage into a river. But I think maybe I would punt that to Andy.
Okay, thanks, Stacey. You're dead on. I mean, so we funded all of our green infrastructure through the State Revolving Fund, through the SRF. And they actually even offered principal forgiveness, meaning you don't have to pay a portion of the loan back, and then the balance of it was less than 1% interest spread out over 30 years. So that was tremendous. The other thing, as Stacey mentioned, some utilities will charge a stormwater fee to for impervious surface. So, for example, if you if you have a driveway or a parking lot, they would charge you based on the area, because once the stormwater hits the impervious surface and goes into the combined sewer, it mixes with the sewage and becomes sewage. So they're actually, even though they're not flushing toilets, the parking lot is generating sewage. And so they would charge a stormwater fee, which would then two things. One, it provides revenue, which pays for green infrastructure, which is a fair offset, or it incentivizes the private owner, like the owner of the parking lot or parking garage, to reduce their impervious surface, or maybe put a rain garden in the middle of it and slope the flow into the rain garden, so that they're reducing their impact and therefore reducing their fee.
Okay, thank you. Excuse me. Okay, this is a question for you, Andy. Someone's wondering, what is the long-term goal for Camden, say by 2050, for greened acres? So our goal basically is to eliminate overflows and flooding. So we are at 125 greened acres. Camden is not that large, so we're thinking that probably the ultimate that we could possibly do would be about 250 greened acres. So we feel we're about halfway there. Our modelers have shown us that if we can green 10% of the cities, 10% of the city, we would and undertake the capital infrastructure improvements that I described, that we would be able to eliminate flooding and overflows for 90% of all storms. So that's really our goal. But we also, one of the things we're looking at is possibly implementing a stormwater fee, or working at least with private sector entities to try to encourage them to voluntarily add some green infrastructure, because basically all of our green infrastructure has been on public property. We haven't had anything on private property, so we're hoping to encourage the private sector, either through doing the right thing, philanthropic spirit, or maybe through the stormwater fee, to add that. If we can bring private sector into the mix, then we would definitely be able to exceed that 250 green acres goal. Great. Another question that came in, and I think this can go to Andy or Stacey. What techniques have you found successful in working with well-established and historically vulnerable communities of concern who see any improvements, such as improved streetscapes, bike infrastructures, and possibly green infrastructure, as gentrification, and something that should be actively resisted in their neighborhoods?
Well, I'll take a first stab at that. So one of the things I'll say is that in a city like Camden, where there's so much need, combined sewage flooding is a day in and day out problem every time it rains. So it's not just a once in a while thing. So it was relatively easy to get community buy-in to say, we need to solve this flooding problem for you. And so what we did was, yes, we did modeling in the long run, but we tried to treat it as almost like a triage situation. We need to go where it's flooding the worst and eliminate those problems right away. So we met with each of the communities. There's 21 neighborhoods in Camden City, and we just met with the residents and got their take on where is it flooding and where is flooding, where it's impacting people. And so I think that it's almost like the first thing was eliminating that flooding problem was so important to a quality of life issue that we really haven't had any pushback. I could see, however, that when the flooding is eliminated and now the green infrastructure is a nice to have, and it could end to result in gentrification, then there might be some pushback. But we're not in that phase yet. We're dealing with the immediate problem of eliminating sewage in people's basements or puddles of sewage as their kids walk to bus stops. I think the key on that second phase, is that we need to keep our rates affordable. Affordability is, and I know that's something that EPA is really focusing on as well. Affordability is really, really important, and we need to make sure that when we improve the quality of life for our neighbors, that they're able to live in the neighborhoods that they have historically occupied. They have the right to stay.
This is Stacey. Yeah, I think gentrification is always an issue. It shows up a lot in our brownfields program, but it also shows up around green infrastructure. So when you clean up a site that is contaminated, or if you decrease or get rid of the flooding, or if you add nice community amenities, it tends to raise property values, and there's some gentrification. I think a lot of the communities that I've worked in here, that hasn't been as big an issue because we were working with affordable housing providers, and so either the housing is rental, and it's run by Devon Housing Authority or the Urban Land Conservancy or another group, or it is part of the City and County of Denver's inclusionary housing ordinance and their affordable housing program. So we don't see some of that. Certainly it is an issue that comes up across the country, and I know, I haven't personally experienced it, but I know that a lot of folks who work at EPA, particularly in the Brownfields program, we hear a lot about gentrification. So what happens when this gets cleaned up and everybody's property is worth more, and then property taxes go up, and then people are pushed out. And so that does come up. I know that some communities have looked at ways to try to deal with property tax issues, particularly in EJ communities, but it's something that's very difficult, and I think that's an important question, but I don't know that I have a good answer.
Well, thanks for taking a stab at that. This one's also directed at you, Stacey. What are suggestions to overcoming resistance to infrastructure requirements by communities which operate on low regulatory models? So, for example, municipal opposition to setbacks, new zoning laws, etc.
There's always, it's interesting. I think you always have people that are in opposition to something, that change is hard for them, and they see bad things in the future by change. I think really the most important piece is including people in up front, and there's been some numerous examples that I'm aware of in our region where they did really good community planning up front, and they didn't get a lot of opposition, and in some cases where they didn't do good community planning, and then things were a nightmare later, because the city might feel that well, we're doing all these wonderful things for people, of course everybody's going to accept it, but really a lot of it is doing a lot of community planning up front, and getting having a lot of meetings. A lot of times it can be how you structure your meetings too, to make sure we've had some problems, in some places where the meetings get taken over by certain people that like to be behind a microphone, and not everybody gets listened to, and some of the people actually don't even live in the community, they come from somewhere else, and so trying to figure out how they structure those meetings to get community input. Sometimes it can be really difficult when you're doing really large infrastructure projects in fairly large areas, because it's hard to see all of the interrelationships, and people tend to have the community meetings focused around the particular local project, and the community doesn't understand how it fits into the bigger picture. And so trying to also do some meetings around how all these pieces fit in together. And stormwater infrastructure is very complex, and a lot of times they're moving stormwater from one part of the city to another part, and so trying to involve all the people definitely it's pretty challenging.
Okay, Andy, the next question is for you. Now that New Jersey municipalities are allowed to implement stormwater utility fee programs, is Camden County considering forming one to fund water quality and flood mitigation projects? And if yes, is there a strategy to limit the effects of the additional fees on low-income households?
That is a good question. So we just the legislation literally just got passed, like I think a month or so ago. So it's really quite new. We have been thinking about it quite a bit, and I think that there's really so Camden County has 37 municipalities, of which 35 are separate sewers and 2 are combined. Camden City and also another smaller city, Gloucester City. And so I think that what we ultimately do would be sort of along those breakpoints. If in other words, if there was to be a utility, there might be like 2 different courses of action: one for the separate stormwater systems, and then one for the 2 combined. I think that would probably make a lot of sense, but we're really at the early stages of consideration. The one thing that we would definitely do is be certain about affordability. In fact, what we've already done in Camden City is implemented a host community benefit. Since Camden City hosts the wastewater treatment plant that all 37 municipalities discharge into, Camden residents get a 40% rate discount in order to keep their rate affordable. So we would consider, if we were to get into the stormwater utility aspect, we would certainly continue that kind of approach to make sure that what we were doing was equitable and affordable.
Okay, Stacey, you mentioned the importance of involving people in the whole planning process. So someone's wondering if the public participation and feedback was not part of the planning process for implementing green infrastructure systems within a community, how can we foster community engagement and a positive response to these green infrastructure systems after they've already been installed?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think there's a lot around public outreach that can be done to talk about the successes of what's been put in place. I think that I think the hard part with dealing with infrastructure is, Andy and I are engineers, and a lot of engineers aren't always great communicators, engineers in public works departments typically like to put in place projects and systems and stuff, and so trying to figure out how you either as a municipality or how nonprofits can maybe help you do some of that, but trying to figure out how you tell people about the good things that you do. Certainly, I think in some projects, interpretive signage is helpful in projects to explain maybe what was there before versus what is there now. We've certainly seen a lot of that in a lot of different places. Before and afters tend to be pretty dramatic. Photos tend to tell really good stories to people. I think there's a lot of other things, as far as, outreach events. A lot of municipalities actually have requirements to do outreach around stormwater as far as their under their MS4, their municipal storm sewer permit. And so that's a really good opportunity to go out and work with communities. And so, communities will do different things, whether they put in flyers into folks' water bills, or they go out to community events and set up a booth, or they do door hanger tags for people, or they work with nonprofits, or they work with school kids. So a lot of different opportunities, I think, to do that actually under their permit requirements.
Great, yeah, I think that's really important. Okay, this question is for Andy. And the question is, Stacey mentioned in her presentation the importance of involving the community in the design of EJ solutions. How does Camden do this?
Thanks, Amanda. Well, so what we did is we formed the Camden Collaborative Initiative. So this is an initiative led with EPA Region 2, New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, and our utility are the three core members, and then there's 60 environmental and community service nonprofits that are including neighborhood groups that are in each of Camden's individual neighborhoods, and then also entities that are working in Camden already, like the Trust for Public Land, like the New Jersey Tree Foundation, like the New Jersey Conservation Foundation, local nonprofits like Cooper's Ferry Partnership. They're already working in the communities on various issues. So we partnered with them to make sure that we were hearing from the community what they most needed, and then also letting them know what we were doing, making sure that there was feedback. So we had public meetings in every single neighborhood in Camden City to talk about, and basically just got a map out of their sector. Now, bear in mind, Camden's not as big as, say, Denver, although it's a population of about 80,000 people. At one time, it was double that. So basically, we worked with the neighbors, and we identified where the flooding was, where the green infrastructure ought to be, what type of green infrastructure. The other thing is the Power Corps is a tremendous, they're really like our ambassadors they're from the neighborhoods, they're all from Camden City, and they basically see themselves as appointed, and they are, to help keep the city green. And so there's so much pride in them, and their neighborhoods have pride in. There's so much pride within the Power Corps members themselves, but also the communities are proud of the Power Corps. So that really helps as well. So it's locally driven.
Okay, great. Wow, we have so many questions and not a lot of time left. So let's see. This one isn't directed at anyone in particular, but the question is there any special stormwater and flow accumulation that is specific for cities? With GIS, we could find flow accumulation in forests. I want to know if there's any specifics for cities to identify and implement GSI. I'm wondering if naming GIS.
Well, I'll take a stab at that, but I hope that Stacey and Matt can help me out. But I think that, one of the things that we're seeing is that with climate change, projections are really, past history is not necessarily the prologue of what you're going to see in the future. And so it's really imperative to try to design for worst case scenarios. For example, I served on EPA's climate change task force a few years ago, and they projected that the Delaware River is going to rise by 1.5 feet by 2050. So we have to design not only for the current level of water, but also for the likelihood that the tide could be 1.5 feet higher. Similarly with rain projections, and what GSI, Green Stormwater Infrastructure, can do, we almost have to take the past and add, like Stacey and I are engineers, add like a 20 to 25% safety factor to make sure, because we're really in uncharted territory.
Yeah, I think I'll add to that and I'm not sure I completely understand the question, so hopefully I'm answering what they were talking about. Sometimes we don't always have really great data. We don't have enough rain gauges and things in place to actually measure stormwater. We have some, but a lot of the other work has to be done via modeling, so we typically look at a lot of modeling. What we've used GIS for in our region is we've actually done a large-scale green infrastructure mapping project for our South Platte River watershed, where we looked at the headwaters, the Denver metro area, and the plains, and actually mapped the green infrastructure, and then also looked at the ecosystem service benefits that it provides. So you actually get a pixel on a screen that has a number associated with it on what the value of the green infrastructure would be, what it is currently, and you can compare that to other areas where you have more robust green infrastructure. And so that is like one tool that we've used with GIS that sort of talks about green infrastructure and infers a little bit about the ability of how much stormwater it can infiltrate or not infiltrate.
Thanks to both of you for answering that. Matt, I know we're at time. I do have one question here that's for Stacey and Andy that I feel like could be a good wrap-up question, but I also want to be respectful of people's time. So what are you thinking?
Yeah, I think we can go ahead and proceed with the additional question.
Okay. So Stacey and Andy, are the green infrastructure efforts in your cities all in communities with environmental justice issues, or do you select these efforts / projects based on other criteria?
For EPA, it really depends on what projects that we're doing. So EPA Region 8 covers a 6-state region. So we cover Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, Montana, and North and South Dakota. And so we do projects in all of our states. Many times for the projects that I personally work on, because we're using federal funds and federal employees' time, we tend to put a lot more of our projects into EJ communities, particularly for that reason, because we know they have fewer resources than some of our other communities. But like any community, like the city of Denver, we have EJ neighborhoods, and then we have neighborhoods that are really expensive. But we typically don't put a lot of resources into communities that don't have some environmental justice aspects just because we're using federal funds. Usually then there's, a private developer, or there are, municipalities that maybe have more money that actually can fund that sort of work themselves.
For us, what we look at is we definitely want to put our green infrastructure where people are. The very first GIS program or modeling that we did was to find out where's the flooding and overlay that with where people are. We didn't want to do it in an industrial area, so we definitely have focused on where flooding was impacting people. That tended to be environmental justice communities as well. So I think that the intentionality really was about keeping flooding away from people, and I agree with Stacey. Where possible, we definitely were most interested in where people would have fewer resources to deal with this on their own. So the majority of Camden City really is an environmental justice area, so it wasn't difficult to choose EJ areas, but that certainly would be our preference. It makes sense to optimize benefit for people who need it the most.
Okay, thank you. Matt, do you want me to keep going? I mean, there's probably like 30 more questions.
Yeah, I think we're not going to have time to get to everybody's questions, so this is probably a good time to wrap up. For those whose questions we didn't get to, I would encourage you to reach out via the contact information on the screen, and we are glad to try and help you. I want to give a heartfelt thanks to Stacey and Andy for sharing their perspectives and talking about some of the positive work being done where they live. These projects are inspiring, not only because they're extremely beneficial to communities and the residents, but because they are practical and replicable. It's exciting to know that, they and other communities as well can and are heading in that direction. I want to thank our attendees for joining us today. We truly appreciate your time, and we hope you enjoyed the subject matter today. Stay tuned for our next webcast. We hope to see you there, and have a great day.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Amanda. Great working with you, Stacey.
Thanks, everybody.